He spent 3 years hunting for her across 4 continents. He bribed officials, burned bridges, and buried men who lied to him. He never found her. Then one gray Tuesday morning in Los Angeles, Kang Hyun-jae walked into the pediatric wing of Meridian General Hospital. And there she was, Zaria Bennett, sitting by a window with 2 toddlers beside her. And the moment he saw the little boy's face, the empire he'd built with blood and silence meant absolutely nothing. Because that boy had his eyes, his jaw, his silence. And Hyun-jae knew, with the kind of certainty that doesn't need proof, that everything was about to break open. If this kind of story hits different for you, a man who ruled the underworld brought to his knees by 2 children he never knew existed, then stay until the very last word. Hit that like button right now and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The flight from Seoul landed at LAX at 6:14 in the morning, 40 minutes ahead of schedule, which Hyun-jae took as a bad sign. He didn't believe in luck, good or otherwise, but he'd spent enough years in the business to know that when things came early, it usually meant something was waiting. He moved through customs without incident. His passport was clean. One of 7 he rotated depending on destination, all of them legitimate, all of them expensive. The name on this one read Daniel Kang. The U.S. Customs agent glanced at his face, looked at the photo, stamped the page, and waved him through without a word. People rarely looked at Hyun-jae twice in formal settings. He had a quality that made authority figures uncomfortable in a way they couldn't articulate. Something behind the eyes that suggested the polite surface was exactly that. A surface. His driver, a compact Korean-American man named Seo, who'd been with him for 9 years, met him at arrivals with a black G-Wagon idling at the curb and no small talk. That was why Seo still had a job. Hyun-jae settled into the back seat, loosened the top button of his shirt, and stared out the window at the gray Los Angeles morning as the city unfolded around him. Palm trees and smog, and the particular kind of beautiful ugliness that only this city managed to pull off. He'd been overseas for 6 weeks. The conflict in Busan had required his personal attention, a dispute over shipping lanes between his organization and a rival syndicate that had been festering for 8 months before it turned into something that couldn't be managed with phone calls. 3 of his lieutenants had already tried to broker a settlement. 2 of them came back embarrassed. The 3rd didn't come back at all. So Hyun-jae went himself, and he resolved the situation the way he always resolved things that refused to resolve themselves. Quietly. Permanently. In a way that left no room for ambiguity about what happened to people who tested him. He was 36 years old, and he was tired in a way that sleep didn't fix. The G-Wagon moved through light morning traffic toward the Wilshire corridor, where the high-rise he owned under a shell company offered a penthouse floor with a view of the city he'd spent 12 years quietly consuming. Hyun-jae controlled more of Los Angeles than most people in Los Angeles knew. The shipping empire was legitimate on paper. 3 holding companies, 2 import-export operations registered in Delaware, and a logistics firm with contracts that touched nearly every major port on the West Coast. Underneath that, in the structure that didn't appear on any filing, was something considerably less legitimate and considerably more profitable. He didn't think of himself as a criminal. He thought of himself as a man who understood how the world actually operated, as opposed to how people preferred to believe it did. His phone buzzed. He looked at the screen. His director of operations, a woman named Minji, who ran his Los Angeles office with the terrifying efficiency of someone who had never once in her career made a mistake she didn't immediately correct, had sent a message. Castillo meeting pushed to Thursday. Dock workers' situation still unresolved. And the hospital called again. He stared at that last line for a moment. The hospital had been calling for 3 days. He knew which hospital. He'd seen the number in his missed calls and told himself it was a billing error, or a wrong number, or one of the dozen other mundane explanations that existed for a hospital calling a phone number. He'd been overseas. He'd been dealing with Busan. He didn't have time for hospitals. He typed back, "Which hospital? What did they say?" Minji responded in under 30 seconds. "Meridian General, Pediatric Wing. They asked for you by name. They said it was urgent." He put the phone down and looked out the window again. A woman was walking a dog on the sidewalk. The dog stopped to smell something invisible, and the woman waited with the kind of patience that people have in the early morning, before the day has taken anything from them yet. He told CO to take him to Meridian General. CO didn't ask why. He merged left and adjusted the route. But Meridian General Hospital sat on the eastern edge of Brentwood, a private facility with the kind of understated architecture that communicated money without announcing it. Pale stone facade, manicured entry garden, a parking structure that was 3 times more expensive per hour than any facility in the county. Hyun-jae had donated to their cardiac research wing 2 years ago through a foundation that had his lawyer's name on it, and not his own. He hadn't thought much about it at the time. It was a tax position, not a gesture. He rode the elevator to the 4th floor, pediatric wing, with his hands in his pockets and the faint residual tension behind his shoulder blades that never fully left him, even in clean, well-lit buildings where there was nothing threatening in sight. 12 years in his business wired something into the nervous system that civilian life couldn't reach. He was always, on some level, reading exits. The elevator opened onto a corridor painted in soft yellows and pale blues, the kind of colors chosen by committee to communicate warmth without demanding anything from you. There were drawings taped to the walls, children's drawings, crayon animals and lopsided houses, and the air smelled of antiseptic under something floral, which was worse than just antiseptic alone. A nurse's station sat at the far end of the corridor. A few people moved slowly through the hallway. A father in a wrinkled dress shirt, a woman with a rolling IV stand, an orderly pushing a cart. Hyun-jae walked toward the nurse's station and then stopped. He stopped because of the window. The corridor turned left before the nurse's station, and at the bend there was a wide window that looked out onto a small interior courtyard. A few potted trees, a bench, gray morning light coming through a skylight above. And sitting in a chair beside that window, turned slightly away from him, was a woman. She was wearing a dark green cardigan over a white top, her natural hair pulled back and up, her hands folded in her lap with the particular stillness of someone who was holding themselves together through deliberate effort. She was looking at 2 children seated on the floor in front of her. They were playing with soft blocks, the kind of brightly colored foam shapes they put in pediatric waiting areas. The children were small, maybe 2.5 years old, maybe 3. Hyun-jae stood still. He stood still because his legs stopped working properly, or his brain stopped issuing instructions to his legs, or both. He wasn't sure. His whole body registered the woman before his mind caught up with what his body already knew, and by the time his mind arrived at the same conclusion, he already had his hand against the wall to steady himself. It was Zarya, not someone who looked like Zarya, not a woman with a similar build or similar hair. It was Zarya Bennett, the same set of her shoulders, the same way she held her hands, the same particular angle of her chin when she was watching something she was worried about. He had spent 3 years studying her absence so thoroughly that the sight of her actual presence felt like a physical blow, like something had struck him clean in the chest without warning. He breathed. Once, carefully. Then he looked at the children. The girl was facing away from him, playing with a yellow block, her small fingers working at it with concentration. The boy had turned slightly, reaching for something his sister was holding, and when he turned, Hyun-jae saw his face. The world went quiet. Not metaphorically quiet, the sounds of the hospital, the distant PA system, the wheels on the cart, the soft murmur from the nurse's station, all of it receded to something distant and irrelevant, because the boy had a face that Hyun-jae recognized the way you recognize your own reflection. The jaw, the slight asymmetry at the corner of the mouth, the stillness in the eyes even when the body was moving, that quality of watching from some internal remove that Hyun-jae had seen in photographs of himself at that age. His mother had kept them, had shown them to him once, and had spent his adult life cultivating into something controlled and useful. The boy was 2, maybe 3 years old, and the boy had his face. Hyun-jae did the math without wanting to do the math. 3 years since Zarya disappeared. 3 years since he'd come home from a trip to Seattle to find her apartment empty, her lease broken, her phone disconnected, and no trace of where she'd gone. Not a forwarding address, not a message, not a single word that explained what had happened to the woman he'd been building towards something with for almost 2 years. He'd turned the city inside out looking for her. He'd expanded the search, spent money, called in debts. Nothing. She had simply ceased to exist in his world, except she hadn't ceased to exist at all. She'd been somewhere else, becoming a mother, becoming the mother of his children. He walked toward her, and his footsteps were quieter than they should have been for a man his size, which had always been true of him, the quality of moving through space without announcing himself. But right now it meant that he was standing 3 feet behind her before she registered that anyone was there. She turned. He watched her face do something extraordinary. He watched it go from distracted, the residual blankness of someone who'd been sitting with fear long enough that the fear became background noise, to recognition, and then the recognition collapsed into something that wasn't quite fear, but was adjacent to it. Her whole body went rigid in the chair. Her hands, which had been folded, gripped each other. "Hyunjae," she said. It came out as barely a sound. "Zarya." His voice was level. He'd spent years mastering level. Right now it cost him something. She rose from the chair instinctively, the way you rise when something feels like a threat, even if your brain hasn't processed it as one yet. She stepped sideways, putting herself between him and the children in a gesture so automatic she probably didn't realize she'd done it. He noticed. He noticed everything about her. The way she'd aged. Not badly, but visibly, with the particular quality of aging that comes from prolonged stress rather than time alone. There were shadows under her eyes that hadn't been there 3 years ago. She was thinner, but the intelligence in her face was the same, the sharpness of it, and underneath the fear she was currently experiencing, he could see the same woman who had once challenged him across a dinner table about something that had made him laugh despite himself, which had been a rare thing. "What are you doing here?" she said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of something close to despair. "They called me," he said. "This hospital. They've been calling for 3 days." He paused. "I need you to tell me who those children are." Her jaw tightened. "My children." "I can see that. I'm asking you who their father is." A beat. Something moved across her face. A calculation, or the beginning of a lie, or both, and she said, "Their father isn't in their lives." "That's not what I asked." The boy had stopped playing with the blocks. He was looking up at Hyunjae with the open curiosity of a small child who hasn't yet learned to disguise interest, and the directness of that gaze hit Hyunjae somewhere below the sternum. The boy's eyes were dark, steady, with a particular quality of attention that was his. That was absolutely his. Zarya. He kept his voice low, kept it even. The way you speak when you're working to keep a situation from becoming what it clearly already is. "Look at me and tell me that boy is not mine." She looked at him. She didn't say anything. That silence was its own kind of answer, and they both knew it. She took him down the hall away from the children, who were momentarily in the care of a nurse named Delia, a stout, warm-faced woman who seemed to know Zarya well enough that the handoff happened with a look and a nod. Zarya walked fast, her arms crossed, and Hyunjae matched her pace because he had no intention of letting distance open between them. She stopped at the end of the corridor where a small family consultation room sat empty. A round table, 4 chairs, a box of tissues that had probably seen things no box of tissues should have to see. She went inside and he followed, and she turned to face him before he'd fully closed the door. "You can't be here," she said. "I'm here. You need to leave." "I'm not leaving." He said it without emphasis, without threat, just a statement of physical reality. 3 years, Zarya. 3 years and not one word. Not a message, not a... He stopped himself, pressed it down, got back to level. "I need to understand what is happening." She was watching him with a wariness that he recognized. He'd seen it in men who owed him money, in officials who'd taken his money and were now being asked to deliver on what they'd been paid for. It was the wariness of someone who had made a choice they knew couldn't be fully defended, and who was now in the moment of being asked to defend it. "I left," she said. "I know you left." "Why?" "Because I had to." "That's not an answer." "It is an answer. It's just not the one you want." She uncrossed her arms, pressed her palms flat against the table. "I was pregnant, Hyunjae. I found out 3 days before I left, and I made a decision." The room was very small and very quiet. Outside in the corridor, he could hear the soft sounds of the hospital going about its ordinary business of crisis, which struck him as obscene right now, the idea that other things were continuing. "You decided not to tell me," he said. "I decided to protect them." "From me?" She met his eyes. "Yes." The word landed without apology, and he stood with it for a moment, let it settle somewhere. He had spent his adult life being someone people were afraid of, and he had made his peace with that. It was a feature, not a malfunction, of the kind of authority he exercised. But there was a particular quality to hearing it from her, delivered not with contempt, but with a raw, exhausted honesty that went somewhere different than fear usually went. "I saw something," she said. "Before I left, I saw—" She stopped, started over. "You remember Marcus Chen?" He said nothing. Marcus Chen had been a mid-level associate who had made a catastrophic error in judgment involving a shipment and an FBI informant, and who had then compounded that error by attempting to address it unilaterally, which had created a problem that required resolution. Yes, he remembered Marcus Chen. "I saw what happened," Zarya said. "Not all of it. I wasn't supposed to see any of it. I'd come to the warehouse to— It doesn't matter why I was there. I saw enough. And I was already 3 days pregnant, and I was standing in a parking lot throwing up into a storm drain, and I thought—" Her voice cracked slightly, just at the edge, and she pulled it back. "I thought, if I tell him, these children will grow up inside whatever that is, inside that world. And I couldn't. I couldn't do that to them." He was quiet for a long moment. There was a small window above the table, narrow and high, and through it he could see a wedge of gray sky. "You could have told me," he said finally. "You could have told me what you saw and what you were afraid of, and we could have—" "Could have what?" She looked at him. "What would you have done, Hyunjae? Would you have walked away from the business? Would you have handed everything over to someone else and moved somewhere quiet? Would you have become a different person?" She waited. "Because I knew you. I knew you wouldn't. And I knew that if you knew about the children, they would be yours. And being yours meant being in the middle of whatever you were in the middle of. And I couldn't—" She pressed her hand to her mouth for a second. "I couldn't." He wanted to argue with her. He was aware, even in this moment, that he wanted to argue with her specifically because she wasn't wrong. And arguing with something that isn't wrong is easier than sitting with it. "You said you came back," he said instead. "You're here. You came back for a reason." Something changed in her face. The defensiveness didn't go away, but it was joined by something else, something heavier. And he realized before she said it that whatever she was about to tell him was what the hospital had been calling about. "The girl," she said. "Nia." Her voice shifted on the name, became quieter. "She's sick." He waited. "She was diagnosed 8 months ago. Acute lymphoblastic leukemia." Zarya said the phrase carefully, the way you say something you've had to learn to say because you had no choice but to learn it. They caught it early, they said, which is a relative term when your 2-year-old daughter has leukemia. "We did 2 rounds of chemotherapy. It wasn't enough. We did a 3rd. It helped, and then it stopped helping." She stopped. Her hands were flat on the table and she was looking at them. "The oncology team here, Dr. Patel and her team, they're some of the best in the country for pediatric cases. I brought Naya here because there was nowhere else left to bring her, and they've run every test and tried every protocol that exists, and they're telling me now that the only option that gives her a real chance—" She stopped again. "Is a bone marrow transplant. They need a matched donor. And they haven't found one. They've been searching the registry for 6 months, international registries, nothing close enough." She finally looked up at him. And then Dr. Patel suggested that a direct biological relative, a parent specifically, would have the highest probability of compatibility. And she asked me about the father, and I said— Zarya's breath came out in something that wasn't quite a sound. I said I'd contact him. Hyunjae stood very still. "That's why they called," Zarya said. "I gave them your number. I didn't know what else to do. I have no more options, Hyunjae. I've done everything. I've tried everything. She's my daughter, and she is running out of time, and you are the only person left who might be able to—" Her composure broke just at the edges, and she pressed her hand back over her mouth and breathed through it. "So that's why I'm here. That's the whole thing. Now you know." He looked at her for a long time. Outside the door, Far down the corridor, he could hear the twins. He couldn't make out what sound it was. A laugh, maybe, or a word. Something small and alive. "Take me to her," he said. Nia was in room 412, a private room with pale yellow walls and a large window that faced west and would probably be beautiful in the afternoon when the sun came around. Right now it was morning gray, and the light was flat and clinical. She was sleeping when they came in. She was small. All children were small, but she was small in a particular way that was about more than age, that quality of diminishment that illness puts on a body that isn't finished growing yet. She had Zarya's features, mostly, the curve of her brow, the shape of her nose. But something in the structure of her face, something in the set of it, was his. An IV line ran into her small arm. A monitor beside the bed tracked her vitals in numbers that Hyunjae looked at without knowing precisely what they meant, but understanding from their steadiness that she was stable, currently, which was different from being well. He stood in the doorway. He was not a man who had a lot of experience standing in doorways, unsure whether to cross them. He crossed thresholds. He made decisions. He moved. That was who he was. That was how he'd gotten where he'd gotten. But he stood in this particular doorway for longer than he was comfortable with, looking at his daughter sleeping, and the feeling that moved through him was nothing he had a name for. It wasn't grief exactly, and it wasn't anger exactly, although it contained elements of both. It was something prior to both. Something foundational. Zarya stood just behind him, slightly to the side, watching him watch her. He walked into the room. He sat in the chair beside the bed, the chair that had clearly been slept in, recently, more than once. There was a folded blanket on the arm and a half-finished cup of coffee gone cold on the bedside table beside a book Zarya had probably not been reading. He sat in it and he looked at Nia and he let himself do that for a moment without doing anything else. "When did she come home?" he asked, low. "She's been admitted for 3 weeks, Zarya said from near the doorway. "She had a bad reaction to the last round of treatment. She's stable now, but the window for the transplant..." She stopped. "Dr. Patel says we're looking at weeks, not months, before her condition deteriorates to a point where even a successful transplant wouldn't..." She didn't finish. He nodded once. "I'll be tested," he said. "Hyunjae, I'll be tested today. Now, tell me who to talk to." She looked at him with an expression he couldn't fully read. Relief and something complicated underneath the relief. Something that wasn't quite gratitude and wasn't quite suspicion, but was both. "I'll get Dr. Patel," she said. Dr. Ananya Patel was a small Indian-American woman in her mid-40s with close-cropped gray-black hair and the particular demeanor of someone who had been delivering difficult news for long enough that she'd stopped softening it, not out of cruelty but out of respect. She was precise and direct, and she looked at Hyunjae with the same unimpressed steadiness she probably directed at everyone who came through the pediatric oncology department, regardless of whatever they were in their outside lives, because in here, the only relevant fact was what you could do for the child. He liked her immediately. She explained the process. Tissue typing, HLA matching, compatibility assessment, the timeline. She said it matter-of-factly, the way you explain something to a person you're treating as intelligent, which he appreciated. She didn't editorialize about the ethics of the situation, whether he was the father, why he hadn't been present, none of it. She simply explained what Naya needed and what the testing would determine and what the range of outcomes looked like. "If you're a match," she said, "even a partial match, we have options. A full match gives us the best odds. For Nia's specific case, we're looking at a transplant procedure followed by an aggressive monitoring protocol for the first 100 days. The success rates for match donor transplants in her age group with her specific leukemia profile are," she paused, carefully, "meaningful. This gives her a chance. Without a donor, we are looking at palliative care within 4 to 6 weeks." She said that last sentence cleanly, without flinching, and Hyunjae received it the same way. "Draw the blood," he said. "Whatever you need." The testing happened that afternoon. A nurse named Peterson, young, efficient, uncomfortable in Hyunjae's presence, in a way he was accustomed to ignoring, took the samples, labeled them, sent them to the lab. Dr. Patel said preliminary results would take 24 to 48 hours. Full compatibility results would take longer, but they could begin preparation protocols based on the initial data. He sat in the waiting area outside the lab. Zarya sat across from him, and the twins were with Nurse Delia in the playroom down the hall, which Hyunjae had not yet gone to because he was managing his capacity for revelation in portions, like a man rationing something he didn't know the full supply of. "The boy," he said. "What's his name?" Zarya was quiet for a moment. "Kai." "Kai," he repeated. "Kai and Nia." She looked at her hands. "I picked them before I knew what they'd be. What I mean is, I had the names before I knew anything about who they were going to be. It just felt right." He nodded. "You could have put them with a stranger," he said, not accusatory, trying to understand the map of her thinking. "For the marrow, could have—" "I tried," she said. "I told you, 6 months on the registry. There is no match. There is no stranger who can save her." She looked at him. "Only you. Maybe only you." He sat with that for a while. The hospital went about its business around them. Somewhere down the hall, a child was crying. Not in pain exactly, but in the particular distress of being in a place you didn't want to be. Someone was laughing at the nurse's station, briefly, then the laugh cut off. The PA system paged someone. The fluorescent lights above them hummed at a frequency just below audible. "I'm going to see them," he said. "The twins. Both of them." Zarya didn't argue. She didn't say he had no right, which he'd expected. She simply looked at him for a moment and then nodded, once, and stood. The playroom was painted bright colors, an orangish red, a turquoise, a warm yellow, and had a low table with crayons and paper, a bookshelf with board books, and a corner with foam mats and a basket of toys. Nurse Delia was sitting in a small chair near the window, watching the children and doing something on a tablet. She looked up when they entered, and Zarya gave her a small nod, and Delia gathered her things and slipped out with a quiet efficiency. Kai was building something with wooden blocks at the low table, stacking them with a kind of focused determination that Hyunjae recognized immediately and viscerally as something he himself did with problems, that quality of sustained attention applied to a task until it was resolved. The girl, his sister, was at the bookshelf, pulling books out and putting them back in different configurations, which appeared to be a project of its own devising. Hyunjae sat down on the foam mat near the low table. He just sat there. He didn't perform anything, didn't do anything calculated, just folded himself down to the floor in a way that probably looked strange for a man in a dark dress shirt and tailored trousers, and he sat. Kai looked up at him. Up close, the resemblance was something. The boy had a face that was a negotiation between his parents, Zarya's softness in the brow and mouth, something of Hyunjae in the structure beneath. But the eyes were his, the steadiness of them, the quality of assessment behind what appeared to be simple curiosity. "Hi," Kai said. "Hi," Hyunjae said. Kai looked at him for another moment, and then looked back at his blocks, and added one to the stack, carefully, and it held. He looked back at Hyunjae as if to confirm that he'd witnessed that. "Good," Hyunjae said. Kai appeared satisfied with this and continued building. From across the room, the girl, whose name, it turned out, was Nia's twin-specific nickname for her brother rather than her own name, and who was called Kai Uni by her sister, apparently. The girl looked over at Hyunjae from the bookshelf with wide, measuring eyes, and then returned to her reorganization project. Zarya stood near the door. She was watching all of this with an expression that was complicated in ways he didn't try to parse right now. "How long do you plan to stay?" she said, finally. He looked at her. "How long do you need me?" "Hyunjae, I'm not asking what you want. I'm asking what the situation requires, because whatever the situation requires is what I'm going to do. That's not negotiable." She pressed her lips together. "The testing is 48 hours. Then I'll be here in 48 hours. He paused. "I'll be here before that." "You have—" She made a gesture that was vague enough to encompass the general fact of his empire, his obligations, the entire structure of his existence outside this building. "You have things." "I do," he agreed. "They can wait." He made 3 phone calls from the parking structure that evening. The first was to Min-ji, telling her to push everything non-essential by a week, and to handle the dock worker situation through their attorney on the east side without his direct involvement. The second was to a private security firm he used for specific situations, a 3-person team he trusted, not because trust came easily, but because he'd paid for their discretion and tested it several times, and it had held. He told them where he was and told them he needed a quiet perimeter, no visibility, no profile. They asked no questions, which was what he paid them for. The third call was to his lawyer because he needed a conversation about certain legal arrangements that he was beginning to think about with a clarity he hadn't had 48 hours ago. He sat in the back of the G-Wagon after the calls and looked at the parking structure's gray concrete walls and thought about the last 3 years. He thought about the months of searching, the leads that went cold, the money he'd spent, the people he'd asked. He thought about what it meant that she had been findable. She hadn't been in witness protection, hadn't had institutional support, had just been a private citizen who moved carefully and didn't leave a trail, and what it meant about the limits of his reach that he hadn't found her. He'd told himself he would find her. He told himself that if he just kept the mechanism going, kept applying pressure and resources, eventually something would yield. Eventually nothing had yielded, and somewhere in the second year, he'd begun to understand that she'd chosen not to be found, and that was a different kind of thing than simply being lost. He thought about what she'd said in the consultation room, the parking lot, the storm drain, 3 days pregnant and watching something she wasn't supposed to see. He knew what she'd seen. He'd reviewed the internal record afterward, the way he reviewed all such situations, and he knew what had happened in that parking lot and what it had looked like from the outside to someone who hadn't understood the context, who didn't understand what Marcus Chen had done and what the consequences of that kind of error were in the world Hyun-jae operated in. He understood why she'd seen it the way she'd seen it. He even understood, on an intellectual level, why she'd made the choice she'd made. Understanding it was different from not being furious about it. He was furious. He was furious in a cold, controlled way that he was keeping under his sternum, where he kept things he didn't intend to act on without thinking them through. He had not seen his children for the first 3 years of their lives. He had not known they existed. His daughter was sick, possibly. He wouldn't finish that thought, but he'd thought the shape of it. And he had not been there, had not known, had not had the opportunity to do what he would have done if he'd known. He did not know what he would have done. Zarya was probably right that he wouldn't have walked away from the business. But he would have. He would have arranged things differently. He would have found a different configuration. He would have made the world around his children safer in ways that had nothing to do with ceasing to be who he was. He didn't know how to say that in a way that would be believable, which was its own particular problem. Seo was reading something on his phone in the front seat, giving no indication of interest in any of this. "I'll need a room," Hyun-jae said, "somewhere close to the hospital." "I can have something by tonight," Seo said. "Somewhere quiet." "Yes." He looked at the concrete wall for another moment. Then he got out of the car and went back inside. He found Zarya in the corridor outside Nia's room, leaning against the wall with her phone in her hand, looking at it without looking at it. She heard him coming and looked up and then looked back at the phone, and he read that as a conscious decision not to show him that she'd been hoping he'd come back. "She's still sleeping," Zarya said. "Okay." He stopped beside her, not quite next to her, a considered distance between them. "You should eat something. When did you last eat?" She looked at him sideways. "That's what you're—" "I'm not making a speech. I'm asking a practical question." A beat. "Lunch, maybe." "I'll have something brought, whatever you want." "Hyun-jae, you don't have to—" "I know I don't have to." He looked at her directly. "Zarya, I'm not going to pretend that we don't have a lot to discuss. We do. There are things I want to say to you that I haven't said yet because this isn't the moment for them. But while we're here, in this building, with those 3 kids, I'm going to do what I can do. That includes making sure you've eaten, and that includes whatever the doctors need from me, and that includes anything else that's required. We can have the other conversation later. Can you accept that?" She studied him for a long moment with those sharp, tired eyes. "You haven't changed," she said. Not quite an accusation, not quite a compliment. "No," he agreed. "Some things I haven't. Some things I have. You wouldn't know which is which yet." She was quiet. "Thai food," she said finally. There's a place called Lotus on Wilshire that delivers. The pad CU. I'll have it here in 40 minutes. She almost smiled. It didn't quite get there, but the shape of it crossed her face, and he marked it, filed it somewhere. He pulled out his phone. He was not thinking about the call he'd get from Minji in 48 hours. Would get sooner if certain people in certain positions around the city noticed that he was back and stationary and potentially distracted. He was not thinking about the rival families, the operational details, the dozen things that needed his attention in the world he'd built over 12 years of careful, ruthless work. He was thinking about Kai's blocks, about the way the boy had stacked them with that particular patient focus, about the way Naya looked in the hospital bed, small and still, with the monitor recording her vitals in green numbers that meant she was still here, still in this world, still his. He was thinking about 48 hours. The test results would come in 48 hours, and then he would know what his daughter needed. And then, whatever it was, he would give it. He ordered the food. He sat down on a chair outside room 412. He waited. And somewhere in the hospital, in a room he hadn't been to yet, Kai was probably still building his tower, stacking one block on another with the serious concentration of someone who hasn't yet learned that towers fall. He'd learn that eventually. Every child did. But not tonight. Tonight the tower was still standing. And 48 hours from now, Hyun-jae was going to find out exactly what kind of man he was willing to become for the people behind that door, and whether who he'd already been was something they could survive knowing. The results would tell him part of that answer. The rest, he suspected, was going to cost him more than blood. Mishta? The test results came back in 31 hours, not 48. Dr. Patel delivered them herself, which told Hyun-jae something before she said a word. Doctors who sent nurses with good news. Doctors who came themselves with the complicated kind. She found him in the corridor outside room 412, where he'd spent most of the previous night in a chair that was not designed for sleeping and that he hadn't slept in anyway. He'd dozed somewhere around 3 in the morning at, not sleep exactly, more like the body's unilateral decision to stop processing for 90 minutes. And then he'd been awake again, watching the shift change, watching the nurses move through their routines, watching the sky outside the narrow window at the end of the hall go from black to gray to the flat white of a Los Angeles morning that couldn't decide whether to be overcast or clear. Zarya was inside the room with Nia. She'd been in there most of the night too, rotating between the chair at the bedside and the narrow couch near the window. He'd seen her through the door, through the glass panel, when he'd gotten up to stretch at some point around 2. She hadn't seen him. She'd been looking at Nia with the expression of someone who has made peace with being afraid because the fear has been present long enough that making peace with it was the only survivable option. Dr. Patel stopped in front of him and didn't open with preamble. The preliminary typing came back. Mr. Kang, you're a strong match. HLA compatibility across 6 of 8 markers, with 2 remaining assessments pending from the extended panel. For Naya's profile, 6 of 8 is, this is a meaningful result. This gives us a real option. He absorbed this without expression. What does the procedure look like? Assuming the extended panel confirms what we're seeing, and I expect it will, we'd be looking at peripheral blood stem cell collection, which is less invasive than traditional marrow extraction. We'd stimulate your stem cell production with a course of injections over 4 to 5 days, then collect via apheresis. There's discomfort involved. Some patients experience significant bone pain during the stimulation phase. The collection itself takes several hours. She looked at him steadily. This is not a minor medical undertaking, even for the donor. When can we start? We'd need to wait for the full panel, 24 more hours at most. Then we begin the stimulation protocol immediately. The sooner we move, the better Nia's position going into the transplant. Then we start when you're ready, he said. Whatever you need from me. She nodded once, the kind of nod that contains more than acknowledgement. Then she said, I'll need to speak with Ms. Bennett as well. Shall I? I'll get her. He went to the door of room 412 and knocked once, lightly, before opening it. Zarya looked up from the chair immediately. She'd been awake. He could tell from the quality of her alertness, the kind that doesn't come from being disturbed, but from already being at the surface. Nia was still sleeping. She slept a lot, which he'd been told was a combination of the illness and the medication, the body conserving whatever it could. "Dr. Patel's outside," he said. "She has the first results." Zarya stood immediately. She glanced at Nia, glanced at him, then moved to the door. He held it open, and she passed through, and he followed, and for a moment, just a moment, the proximity of her in the doorway registered physically, the fact of her being real and present, and not a city he couldn't locate, and he pressed it down and focused on Dr. Patel. She delivered the same information slightly differently, watching Zarya's face as she did it. He watched Zarya's face, too. He saw the moment the information landed, the sharp intake of breath, the eyes going briefly bright, and then the hard work of not letting hope get too far ahead of confirmation. Because Zarya Bennett had been in this hospital for 3 weeks and had learned, he suspected, to be careful with hope. It cost too much when it turned out to be premature. 6 out of 8, Zarya said. 6 of 8 on the initial panel. Strong indication will confirm higher compatibility on the extended results. What are the odds? If it confirms. Dr. Patel paused, which meant she was choosing the honest answer rather than the comforting one, and Hyun-jae respected her for it. For Naya's specific leukemia subtype, with her current disease state, a matched donor transplant of this quality gives us approximately a 62 to 68% probability of full remission. I want to be transparent. That is not a guarantee. That is a fighting chance. And right now, a fighting chance is something I did not have to offer you this time last week. Zarya's jaw was set tight. She was doing something precise and controlled with her breathing. 62%. 62 to 68. Yes. Okay. She said it like she was pressing something into a shape she could carry. Okay. When do we start? The conversation that neither of them had been able to have at the hospital, the one Hyun-jae had said could wait, stopped being something that could wait at approximately 9 o'clock that evening. It started over the remains of a meal that neither of them had eaten properly. He'd had food brought from a restaurant down the street, not Thai this time, just something practical, because it was dinner time and they both needed to eat, and he'd made the decision without asking because she was visibly running on nothing. She'd eaten about half of it without tasting it, which he'd also done, and they were sitting across from each other at the small table in the family consultation room, the same room from the day before, which had apparently become their de facto meeting space by default. And the twins were with Nurse Delia in the playroom, and Nia was stable, and there was a beat of quiet that neither of them filled fast enough. "I want you to know," Zarya said, without preamble, "that I understand what I did. I understand that it's not something you can just explain away." She looked at the table. "I made a choice. I don't regret the choice because I was trying to protect them, but I understand that the cost of that choice wasn't only mine to pay." "No," Hyun-jae said. "It wasn't." "I know. 3 years, he said. He said it quietly, without performance. "I had people looking for you for 2 years. Not because I was—" He stopped. "I need you to understand what that time was, what it was like to not know if you were safe, if something had happened to you. I assumed eventually that you'd chosen to go, that it was a choice, but I didn't know why, so I didn't know what I'd done, and not knowing what you'd done wrong is—" He pressed his hand flat on the table. "That's its own kind of thing." Zarya was looking at him now. Her eyes were steady and direct, and he could see the effort behind that directness, the way she was making herself hold the conversation instead of retreating. "You hadn't done anything wrong," she said. "It wasn't about you doing something wrong. I know what it was about. You told me, the parking lot." "Yes, and you were afraid of what you'd seen." "I was terrified," she said, and there was nothing rhetorical about the word. It landed flat and honest. "I was terrified of what you were capable of. Not just that, what you were comfortable with. That's different. Being capable of something and being comfortable with it are two different things, and you were—" She stopped. "You were very comfortable." He didn't disagree. "It's not the world I'd have chosen for them either. But it's the world you're in." "Yes, and you're still in it. Right now. Today." "Yes," he said again. She looked at him for a long moment. "So what changes? If the transplant works, if Nia recovers, what changes about the situation? About—" She gestured between them. Any of this. About what kind of life those children have if you're in it. I don't know yet, he said. I'm not going to tell you something that sounds right just to tell you something. That seemed to catch her slightly off guard. She'd expected, maybe, the version of the answer that smoothed things over, the reassurance. He wasn't going to give her that. He'd spent too much of his life giving people what they needed to hear, and he was not going to do that with her. Not now, not in this room. I know what I want, he said. I want to know my children. I want to be in their lives in a form that doesn't put them at risk, and I don't have the full answer for how to build that yet because I found out they existed 36 hours ago. But I know that I want it, and I know that wanting it is not optional for me at this point. It's just done. It's decided. What if I say no? No to what? To you being in their lives. What if I say that's not what I want? That what's best for them is to go back to what we had? You mean them not knowing their father exists? She held his gaze. What if that's what I say? I would tell you, he said carefully, that you can say it. And then I'd tell you that we'd be in a legal dispute inside a week because I have rights, and I'm now aware that they exist and I won't give them up. He paused. I'm not threatening you. I'm telling you the truth. There's a difference. There's not a lot of difference from where I'm sitting. Zaria. He leaned forward slightly. I don't want to fight with you. That's also the truth. I want to, I don't know what I want to call it. I want us to solve this in a way that doesn't destroy everyone involved. But I need you to understand that walking away from my own children is not one of the solutions. That option doesn't exist. She was quiet for a long beat. He could hear the building around them, the PA system, distantly, the soft mechanical sounds of a hospital at night. Kai asked about you, she said finally. He went still. Tonight, when Delia was getting him ready for bed, in the little cot they set up in the corner of the waiting room, he asked who the man was, the one who sat on the floor with him. She looked at the table. He said you were quiet. He said that like it was a positive thing. Most men he meets make too much noise, apparently. He's 2.5 years old, and he has opinions about men who make too much noise. Something moved through Hyunjae's chest that he didn't examine too closely. What did you tell him? He said. I said you were someone I used to know, that you were kind. She paused. I don't know why I said that last part. It just came out. He looked at her for a moment. Because it's also true, he said. Some of the time. She almost smiled. Tan. The call from Minji came at 11:17 p.m., and the content of it changed things. He was in the corridor when his phone vibrated, and he saw Minji's name and stepped toward the window at the end of the hall, angling his body slightly away from the nurse's station out of habit. Talk, he said. Minji's voice was controlled in the way it got when she was managing something she didn't fully have contained yet. There's movement. The Serrano people, you remember the conversation about the port contract dispute from last month? I remember. They appear to have heard that you're back in the city, and they appear to have heard that you're… A pause. Careful. Not fully available. He was quiet. Someone talked, Minji said. I don't know who yet, but they know you're hospital adjacent and that your security profile is light right now. I have 3 separate reports from different sources in the last 4 hours. They're not moving yet, but they're positioned. How many? At least 6 that I can confirm. Probably more. The Serrano family has been looking for an opening since the Busan situation resolved in your favor. This… She stopped. This looks like an opening to them. He looked out the window. The parking lot below was quiet. A few cars. The amber of the lot lights. His 2-person security team, he'd called for 3, gotten 2 who were immediately available, were somewhere down there. He'd been operating on a minimal footprint because he'd come to the hospital without intending to stay, and now he'd been here for 31 hours with his daughter in room 412, and his son in a cot in the waiting area, and the woman he'd spent 3 years searching for 20 feet away, and the minimal footprint was suddenly a problem. Pull in 2 more from Vasquez, he said. Tonight, and get me Chan directly. I want eyes on the Serrano operation within the hour. Chan's already on it. Good. And Minji… He paused. No one discusses the hospital. Anyone who's been briefed on my location, I want to know who they talk to. Already pulling comms. I'll have something by morning. Faster. I'll have something by 3 a.m. He hung up and stood at the window for a moment. The parking lot below, the amber lights, the still cars. He'd known, on some level, that this was a risk when he'd told Sio to drive here instead of the penthouse. He'd known that staying, really staying, setting up, making phone calls from the parking structure, was the kind of thing that created a pattern, and patterns were vulnerabilities. He'd known this, and he'd stayed anyway, because his daughter was in room 412 and his son had asked who the quiet man was, and the calculation had come out the same way regardless of what he knew. He went back down the corridor and stood outside room 412 for a moment. Through the glass panel in the door, he could see the monitor, the green numbers, the small, still shape of Nia in the bed. The light in the room was low. He could see the edge of the chair where Zarya would be sitting when she came back from the consultation room, which she'd gone to 15 minutes ago to call someone. A friend, he thought. Someone named Diane, who'd apparently been managing logistics for Zarya's absence from work for the past 3 weeks. He thought about telling her. He thought about what that conversation looked like. Hey, by the way, the family I'm in conflict with may have found us. The thing you ran from 3 years ago has potentially followed us into the pediatric wing of a hospital. The nightmare you were trying to prevent for your children is... He pressed his thumb against the doorframe hard. He needed to handle this before it became something that required explaining. He pulled out his phone again and sent a single message to the number for his security lead. Perimeter check. Every entrance. Now. Zarya came back to room 412 at 12 minutes past midnight and found Hyun-jae standing inside, near the window, looking at the parking lot below, with an expression she didn't immediately recognize. She recognized it about 4 seconds after she walked in, because she'd seen it before. Not often. He'd been careful, when they were together, about letting the professional register bleed into what they had, but she'd seen it once or twice. The quality of stillness that wasn't calm. The kind of stillness that was actually the opposite of calm, held in check by discipline. What happened? She said. He looked at her. Nothing yet. That's not the same as nothing. She came further into the room, kept her voice low for Nia's sake, and stopped near the chair. Hyun-jae, what happened? He looked at her for a moment, and she could see the decision happening. Whether to tell her, whether to soften it, how much. She watched him decide. There's a family, he said, that I'm in a dispute with, over business. They've known for some time that I'd be returning to the city, and it seems they've also determined where I am. He said it flatly, evenly. It's a precautionary situation right now. My people are on it. She stared at him. A precautionary situation, she repeated. Yes. In the hospital where your daughter is having a bone marrow transplant. She hasn't had the transplant yet. The stimulation protocol starts. That's not the point. Her voice came out lower than she'd intended, pressed down by the effort of not raising it, because raising it would wake Nia, and she wasn't going to do that. Do you understand? Do you actually understand that this is what I was afraid of? This, exactly this, is what I left to prevent. And you've been here for 31 hours, and it's already, I am handling it. You always handle it. The edge in her voice was a clean, cold thing. That's what you always say, and you're always right. You do handle it. It doesn't come apart around you, but the people standing next to you while you handle it... She stopped, pressed her hand over her mouth for a second. My children are in this building. I know where your children are. Then act like it. I am acting like it. I have additional security arriving within the hour, and I have people running intelligence on the Serrano operation, and I'm standing in this room instead of... He stopped himself, recalibrated. I am handling it, he said again, and this time it was quieter, less defensive. I'm not going to let anything happen in this hospital. That is a promise, and it is not an empty one. She looked at him for a long moment. Her hands were at her sides, still. Her breathing was even. He could see the effort behind that evenness. If I asked you to leave, she said, right now, to go somewhere else and run your operation from a distance and let the testing continue without you physically present, would you do that? A beat. No, he said. Because if they move, they'll move toward where I am, regardless of whether I'm standing in this building or outside it. My being in this building means my people are in this building. That is better, not worse, For what's in room 412? She held his gaze. He held hers. The monitor beeped softly, steadily, the green numbers going about their work. I hate, she said, that you're not wrong about that. I know. She turned away from him, moved to the chair, sat down in it, and looked at Nia. He stayed near the window. The silence between them wasn't hostile. It was the silence of two people in a situation neither of them designed, and both of them were now, irrevocably, inside. If anything, she said finally, looking at Nia and not at him, if anything happens in this hospital, to her, to Kai, to anyone, I will never… She didn't finish. Nothing will happen to them, he said. She didn't respond. She just sat there, watching Nia breathe, and he stood at the window, watching the parking lot, and they were both watching the same thing from different angles, which was the edge of something they couldn't see the other side of yet. His phone vibrated. He looked at it. The message was from Chan, his intelligence lead, and it contained 4 words and a number. The 4 words were Serrano confirmed, hospital targeted. The number was tonight. He looked at the message for 3 seconds. Then he put the phone in his pocket and turned from the window and said quietly, Zarya, I need you to listen to me very carefully. She turned from the chair and looked at his face and read it, and the color left her expression. What? She said. They're moving tonight, he said. I need you to take the twins and go with Seo. He's downstairs. He's going to take you to a location that is… I'm not leaving Nia. Zarya, I am not leaving my daughter. Her voice was absolutely flat like concrete, not arguable. Tell me what else you need me to do. Tell me where to go with the children, which floor, which room, anything. But I'm not leaving this building without Nia, and Nia cannot be moved. He looked at her. Okay, he said. He made the decision in that moment, the full shape of it, and he was already moving toward the door. Okay, lock this door when I leave. Do not open it for anyone who doesn't say the word Busan first. Do you understand? Busan, she repeated. No one else. Not a nurse, not a doctor, not… I understand. She was already on her feet, already moving toward the door to lock it behind him. Go. He went. And behind him, he heard the lock engage, and the sound of it, that small mechanical click of something secured, was the last ordinary sound of the night, because 30 seconds later, the emergency alarm in the east stairwell began to scream, and the hospital corridor outside room 412 went from quiet to chaos in the span of… The alarm lasted 11 seconds before someone cut it. That was the first thing wrong. Emergency alarms in hospitals didn't get cut. They ran until the situation was resolved or until the fire marshal physically silenced them. They didn't stop in 11 seconds unless someone with access to the building's control systems had made a deliberate decision to stop them, which meant someone was inside the infrastructure of this building in a way that had nothing to do with the Serrano family showing up at the door. Hyunjae processed this in the 3 seconds it took him to reach the end of the corridor and assess the east stairwell door. It was closed. No smoke, no visible breach. He pushed through it and went down 1 flight and found what he expected to find. The emergency exit on the 3rd floor had been propped open with a folded piece of cardboard, the kind of low-tech solution that worked precisely because it was invisible until you were looking for it. Someone had been inside this building already. Before tonight, before the alarm, he let the stairwell door close behind him and stood in the 3rd floor corridor for 3 seconds, running the logic. The Serrano family had intelligence about his location. They had access to the hospital's alarm system, or access to someone who had access to it. They'd propped an exit on a lower floor, probably hours ago, during visiting hours when foot traffic made one more person with a held-open door invisible. They were not improvising. This was a prepared operation. He pulled his phone and called his security lead, a former military contractor named Torres, whose actual first name Hyunjae had never learned and never asked about. Torres picked up on the first ring. East stairwell, 3rd floor, Hyunjae said. Propped exit. They've been inside. I have 2 contacts in the parking structure, Torres said, his voice flat and operational. Moving now. I've got Park on the west entrance and Reyes at the elevator bank on the ground floor. How many inside? Unknown. At least 2 confirmed outside. If they propped the exit hours ago, they could have staged already, could be holding positions on multiple floors. Get Park to 4, now, before they reach it. On it. He hung up and moved back to the stairwell and went up, not down, taking the stairs at a pace that was fast without being loud. A skill that lived in the body, not the mind, the product of years of moving through spaces where being heard before being seen was the difference between control and crisis. His shoes on the concrete steps made almost no sound. He reached the 4th floor and came through the door into the corridor, and it was wrong immediately. The corridor lights were on. They were always on. Hospitals never went fully dark. But the nurse's station at the far end was empty. Not shift change empty. Not stepped away for a moment empty. Abandoned empty. The chair pushed back, a clipboard on the floor, a coffee cup sitting at the edge of the desk where someone had been holding it when something made them stand up fast. He moved along the wall, keeping his profile small, reading each doorway as he passed it. Room 408, empty, dark. Room 410, a patient, sleeping, monitor running, no threat. Room 412, the door was closed. He couldn't see through the glass panel because someone had taped a piece of paper over it from the inside, which meant Zarya had done exactly what he'd told her to do and more, had improvised, had taken the instructions and extended them with her own judgment. Something in him registered that with a clarity that was almost physical. He stopped at room 412 and said, low against the door, Busan, 3 seconds. Then the lock clicked and the door opened 2 inches and Zarya's eye appeared in the gap. And then the door opened fully and he went inside and she pushed it closed behind him and he heard her lock it again. The room was dim. Nia was awake, which surprised him. She was sitting up in the bed with the slow, careful uprightness of someone whose body doesn't have the energy to move quickly, looking at him with Zarya's eyes in his face, steady and watchful. Kai was on the floor near the bed, pressed against it, not crying, not making a sound, which told Hyunjae something about the boy that he stored somewhere significant. The girl, Zarya had told him the other twin's name was Amara, and he'd been holding it, turning it over, was in Zarya's arms, face pressed against her mother's shoulder. How many? Zarya said. Unknown. At least 2 outside confirmed, possibly staged inside. He moved to the window, checked the angle, checked the parking lot. From this position, he could see Torres's car at the far end of the lot and nothing else that shouldn't be there. My people are moving. How long? I don't know yet. She absorbed this. Okay, she said. One word, flat, functional. She was operating, he noticed, on some register below fear. Not past it, but underneath it, the way people do when fear becomes a condition of existence rather than an emergency. She'd been in crisis mode for 3 weeks. She knew how to function inside it. He stayed near the window. The corridor outside was quiet. The alarm was still off. Somewhere in the building, something was being decided, and the next several minutes would resolve which direction it went. His phone vibrated. Torres. West stairwell. 2 confirmed. Armed. Moving toward 4. Then, 8 seconds later, a second message from a number he didn't recognize. He looked at it. It was a photograph. The photograph showed a hallway. The hallway outside room 412, he realized, looking at the distinctive pale yellow paint and the children's drawings on the wall, taken from the direction of the nurse's station. It was time-stamped 40 minutes ago. Before the alarm. Before any of this. And standing in the hallway in the photograph, talking to a man Hyunjae did not recognize, was someone he did. He looked at the photograph for 4 seconds. Then he called Min-ji. She picked up before the first ring finished. I know, she said. How long have you known? 20 minutes. I was running the comms trace you asked for, and A pause. Not hesitation. Min-ji didn't hesitate. It was something else. It's Seo. The name landed in the room without a sound, because Hyunjae didn't make a sound when he received it. He stood at the window and looked at the parking lot below, and the car that Seo drove was at the east end, where it had been all evening, and Seo was presumably in it, and Seo had been with him for 9 years. Seo, he said. His call's going back 6 weeks. He's been in contact with a Serrano intermediary since before you left for Busan. The volume increased when you landed at LAX yesterday. He would have notified them of your location within the hour of arrival. 6 weeks. Before Busan. Seo had known about the conflict with the Serrano family and had been feeding them information for at least 6 weeks, possibly longer, possibly for the entire lead up to the Busan situation, which would explain certain things about how that conflict had escalated in the first place, why his initial lieutenant's settlement attempts had failed so completely, why the Serrano family had seemed to know his operational posture before he'd implemented it. 9 years. Pull Park off the fourth-floor entrance and put him on the G-Wagon, he said. Seo does not leave that vehicle. Already done. Minji paused again. Hyunjae. He also told them about the hospital, about the children. He stood at the window. About the children, he repeated. I'm sorry. He put the phone down without ending the call and stood there for a moment, and the feeling that moved through him was not the cold, contained fury of the consultation room or the controlled urgency of the last 40 minutes. It was something older and more foundational. It moved through his chest and his hands and settled somewhere at the base of his skull, and he recognized it for what it was, which was the particular sensation of being betrayed by someone you trusted with your actual life, by someone who had been in the car with you, had stood behind you, had known the things that could be used against you, and had given them to someone whose interest was your destruction. Seo had told them about the children. That meant the Serrano family knew that Hyun-jae was in this hospital, not because of business, not because of any operational reason that could be managed or reframed, but because his daughter was dying and he was her donor. They knew he was compromised. They knew he was stationary. They knew that moving against him here, now, meant choosing a moment when the thing that could stop him from simply walking away was locked in room 412 with a cardiac monitor and an IV line. They'd chosen this location specifically. They'd chosen this moment specifically, not because it was convenient, because it was the moment when Kang Hyun-jae could not run. He turned from the window. Zarya was looking at him with an expression that had shifted in the last 30 seconds, reading his face the way she'd always been able to read his face, better than almost anyone, which had been one of the things about her, that she looked at him and saw past the surface in a way that had felt like a gift when they were together and felt like exposure right now. Someone inside your organization, she said. Not a question. Yes. How long? Long enough. She looked at him. Do they know about the children? A beat. He'd learned, over 12 years, that the most useful thing you could do with a hard truth was deliver it without softening it, because softening it just delayed the impact without changing it. Yes, he said. The sound she made was barely a sound. It was the sound of someone receiving something they'd been afraid of for a long time, and finding that the reality of it was worse than the anticipation. She pressed her hand over Amara's back, tightened her arms around her daughter, and looked at Nia in the bed, and then she looked at the locked door, and then she looked at him. Get them out of this building, she said. I can't move, Nia. I know that. Her voice was steady, barely. Get Kai and Amara out. Get them somewhere safe, and then... She stopped. Then we deal with whatever is on the other side of that door. He was already typing the message to Torres. The next 22 minutes were the longest of Hyun-jae's adult life, which covered considerable ground in terms of long minutes. Torres moved Kai and Amara out through the west stairwell with Park running interference on the ground floor. A controlled extraction that took 11 minutes and involved Nurse Delia, who turned out to possess a remarkable composure under pressure, guiding the children through the basement corridor to a service exit where a second vehicle was waiting. Hyun-jae had not looked at Kai's face when Torres lifted him from the floor. He could not afford to look at Kai's face right now because looking at Kai's face would compromise his capacity to function, and his capacity to function was the only thing standing between his family and what was on the other side of the door. He'd heard Kai's voice, though. One word, directed toward the door as Torres carried him out. A small, clear, unbothered, bye. He'd pressed his fist against his sternum and breathed through it and turned back to the window. With the twins out and en route to a secure location, the situation in room 412 contracted to its essential elements. Nia in the bed, Zarya in the chair, Hyun-jae at the window, and 2 confirmed armed contacts in the west stairwell making their way toward the 4th floor. Torres and Reyes intercepted them in the stairwell between the 3rd and 4th floor landing, which Hyun-jae knew from the sounds, brief, controlled, not the extended chaos of a firefight, but the compressed violence of a close-quarters confrontation resolved by professionals who were better positioned than the people they were confronting. He'd heard it before, that specific acoustic signature. He knew what it meant. He waited. Torres. West stairwell clear. 2 down, non-lethal, security restrained. Police will be on scene in 8 minutes. Hyunjae looked at the message and then looked at the room and thought about police arriving at a scene that contained 2 restrained and injured members of the Serrano organization. A man with his name in several active law enforcement databases under the title Person of Interest, and a hospital room with a sick child who was 2 days from beginning a life-saving medical procedure. He thought about this quickly and completely, the way he thought through operational problems, identifying the variables and the pressure points and the sequences. Then he sent a single message to his lawyer, Ethan Marsh. Meridian General, 4th floor, 45 minutes. Bring everything. Marsh would understand what everything meant. Torres. 1 more contact unaccounted for. East side. Looking. He read that message and looked at the door, and then he heard footsteps in the corridor. Not the soft professional movement of his people, but something harder, less disciplined. The footsteps of someone who was moving fast because the situation had turned against them, and fast was the only option left. He was at the door before the handle moved. The door was locked. The handle moved anyway. Someone trying it, finding resistance, trying again with more force. Then a pause. Then something that was not a knock, the flat impact of a shoulder against the door, testing the integrity of it. Hyunjae put his hand flat against the door from the inside. He looked back at Zarya. She had positioned herself between the bed and the far wall, between Naya and the door. Her face was pale and completely still. He looked at the door. Kang! A man's voice from the corridor, accented English, controlled, someone who'd been told to be professional about this. Open the door. We're not here for the woman or the kids. Just you. He didn't respond. The kids are already gone, the voice said. We're not interested in them. Open the door and walk out, and this ends in the corridor. You have my word. The word of a Serrano intermediary meant precisely nothing, and they both knew that, and the fact that the offer was being made at all told Hyunjae something about the situation in the corridor. That this man was alone, that his backup was neutralized, that this had become a last option play by someone who'd watched the operation collapse and was now improvising. Improvising people made mistakes. He stepped back from the door. He looked at Zarya and held up one hand. Wait. And she held her position, her eyes on him, tracking. He picked up the chair from beside the bed, the chair she'd been sleeping in, the one with the folded blanket on the arm, and he positioned himself 6 feet from the door, and he waited. The shoulder hit the door again, harder, and the frame cracked slightly at the top, the old institutional paint fracturing, and on the third impact the lock gave. Not the deadbolt, the whole plate, the door swinging inward with the kinetic momentum of someone's full body weight behind it. And the man came through the doorway already off balance, one hand reaching to grab the frame, and Hyunjae moved. It was over in a few seconds. The chair connected. The man hit the floor. Hyunjae had his knee on his back, and the man's right arm at an angle that made further resistance a very painful proposition before the man had processed what had happened. He was younger than Hyunjae had expected. Mid-20s, dark jacket, the kind of face that hadn't yet learned to hide effort. He was breathing hard against the hospital floor tile, which smelled of disinfectant. Don't, Hyunjae said quietly as the man shifted. The shift stopped. Silence. Nia's monitor beeped steadily from the bed. Hyunjae looked up at Zarya over the man on the floor, and she met his eyes, and he saw in her face something he hadn't seen yet in this hospital in these 30-some hours. Something past exhaustion and past fear and past the complicated grief of a woman who'd run from this world and been dragged back into it. What he saw was fury, clean and cold and directed not at him for once, but at the situation, at the man on the floor, at the fact of it. Torres came through the broken door 40 seconds later with Reyes behind him and took custody of the man on the floor with the efficient impersonality of people who did this as a professional matter. Hyunjae stood up and straightened his shirt, and his hands were steady, and his breathing was steady, and he was aware that this was a thing he was capable of, this particular steadiness in the aftermath of violence, that Zarya was watching, and that she had always found difficult to reconcile with the other parts of him. He didn't try to manage her perception of it right now. He just let it be what it was. The police arrived in 6 minutes, not 8. Marsh arrived 12 minutes after that. A trim, gray-haired man in an expensive dark coat who moved through the hospital with the quiet authority of someone whose entire professional life had been spent navigating the intersection of serious money and serious trouble. He spoke to the officers with the fluency of someone who had done this before, who knew which words opened spaces and which ones closed them. And within 30 minutes, the situation in the corridor had been restructured into something that positioned Hyun-jae as a private citizen whose hospitalized daughter had been placed at risk by individuals connected to an organized crime dispute, which was true, technically, if incompletely, and whose security contractors had responded to a credible threat. It was not a perfect restructuring. Nothing was perfect. But it was functional, and it would hold long enough for what needed to happen next to happen. Hyun-jae stood with Marsh in the corridor, while Zarya was inside with Nia, and the police were finishing their documentation at the far end of the hall. "Seo," Hyun-jae said. Marsh nodded. He'd been briefed by Min-ji on the drive over. "That's a complicated situation. It's a simple situation. He made a choice. The choice has consequences. The legal exposure from... I'm not talking about legal exposure. I'm talking about consequences." He looked at Marsh. "Handle the legal exposure. I'll handle the rest." Marsh looked at him for a moment with the expression of a man who had represented Kang Hyun-jae for 8 years and had learned to identify exactly when pushing back was productive and when it was not. This was not a productive moment. "All right," he said. "And the transplant," Hyun-jae said. "I need the hospital administration in a room tomorrow morning. Dr. Patel, whoever runs this facility, whoever needs to sign off on what happened tonight. I need to make sure that Nia's procedure is not impacted by this. I'll arrange it. Tonight. I need confirmation tonight that the protocol continues as scheduled. I'll have something from the medical director within the hour." He nodded. Marsh moved away toward the nurse's station and his phone and the particular machinery of crisis management that justified the extraordinary sum he was paid to be available at midnight on a weekday. Hyun-jae stood in the corridor. The children's drawings on the walls looked different at this hour. The crayon animals and lopsided houses, the artwork of small people who'd been in this wing for reasons that had nothing to do with the events of the last hour. He looked at them for a moment. Then he went back into room 412. Zarya was sitting on the bed beside Nia. Not in the chair. On the actual bed, which she'd apparently decided was where she was going to be right now, with one arm around her daughter's thin shoulders and Nia's head leaning against her side. Nia was awake, looking at the broken door with the calm, interested expression of a small child who has been told to remain calm and has decided that calm is the most interesting available option. He stopped inside the doorway. "She wants to know if there are more," Zarya said. She was looking at Nia, not at him. He crouched down slowly to Nia's eye level. The girl looked at him with those dark, steady eyes, and up close he could see how thin she was. Not just the general smallness of childhood, but the specific thinness of a body that had been fighting for a long time. And he looked at her, and she looked back at him with a directness that was almost challenging. "Are there more bad people?" Nia said. Her voice was thin with illness, but the diction was precise. Zarya had clearly read to her constantly. "No," he said. "The bad people are gone." She considered this. "Did you make them go?" "My friends helped." She nodded slowly, as if this was a reasonable answer that confirmed a hypothesis she'd already formed. Then she looked at her mother. "Mama, he's the quiet man, like Kai said." Zarya closed her eyes for a moment. "I know, baby." "I like him," Nia said, with the clean, undefended honesty of a child who has not yet learned to make anything complicated out of a simple feeling. "He can stay." He stood up before what was happening in his chest could reach his face, turned toward the window, put his hand against the frame, and stood there for a moment looking at the parking lot with the amber lights and the cars and the completely ordinary 3 a.m. Los Angeles quiet. He heard Zarya's voice behind him, soft, talking to Nia about going back to sleep, and the small sound of Nia settling, and the monitor continuing its steady reporting of a heartbeat that was still present, still fighting. He stood at the window. When he turned around, Nia was asleep again, her head on the pillow, Zarya's hand on the blanket edge. Zarya was looking at him. "I need to say something to you," she said. "Okay, what I said in the consultation room about what I'd seen, about why I left, I still believe all of it. I'm not taking it back." She held his gaze. "But I've been sitting here for the last hour watching you, and She stopped. Started differently. I have spent 3 years being certain that bringing you into their lives was the worst thing I could do for them. And tonight, you. She pressed her hand over her mouth briefly. Kai and Amara are safe because of you. Nia is safe because of you, and I don't know what to do with that. You don't have to do anything with it tonight, he said. She looked at him. Who was it? Inside your organization. He told her. She went very still. 9 years, she said. Yes. And you didn't know? No. He said it without flinching. I didn't know. That's the truth of it. She was quiet for a long moment. He could see her thinking, working through the implications, the architecture of it. What it meant that someone that close, that long-standing, had been compromised. What it meant for the structure he'd built. What it meant for whatever came next. Is it over? She said. The Serrano situation. Is tonight the end of it? He looked at her steadily. No. Tonight was a move. They'll regroup. They'll try something else. He paused. This doesn't end until I end it. That's how this kind of conflict works. She absorbed this with her hands in her lap and her eyes on the blanket edge. So it's not over, she said. Not yet. But it will be. Yes. He said it with the specific quality of certainty that wasn't bravado. It was operational clarity, the statement of a man who had resolved things before and knew his own capabilities without embellishment. It will be. She looked up at him. And the transplant, Nia's procedure. Starts in 2 days, as scheduled. I spoke to Marsh. The hospital administration will confirm in the morning. Nothing about tonight changes that. Something moved across her face. Not relief, exactly. She was too careful with relief at this point to let it come clean. But the beginning of something. The tentative opening of a door she'd been holding shut. I gave you their names, she said quietly. Kai and Naya and Amara. I didn't give them your name. I told myself it was to protect them. She looked at Nia. But I think part of it was, I think I was afraid that if they had your name, they'd be real. You'd be real. And what I'd done would be... She stopped. Harder to justify. He moved to the chair. He sat in it, across from her, and he put his elbows on his knees and he looked at his hands for a moment and then looked at her. Zarya, he said, I'm not going to tell you I forgive you, because forgiveness isn't what this is. This is, we have 3 children. One of them is sick, and in 2 days I'm going to start a medical procedure that might help her get better. The other 2 are somewhere safe right now because you trusted me enough to let me get them out. He looked at her directly. That's what we have. We can build from that, or we can spend the next several years being angry at each other. But I know which one of those options I want. She held his gaze for a long time. The transplant might not work, she said. Not a challenge, just the raw fact of it, the one she'd been living with for weeks. I know. 62% is not a guarantee. I know. And if it doesn't, then we deal with that, he said. Together, we deal with it. He paused. You're not doing any of this alone. That's done. Whatever comes next, you're not doing it alone. She looked at him for a long time. Then she looked at the broken door. Then she looked back at him with an expression that contained, underneath everything, underneath the fear and the exhaustion and the 3 years and the terrible events of the past hour, something that had not gone away even when she ran. Something that had been there when she'd told the nurse he was kind, something she probably didn't want him to see yet. He saw it. He didn't say anything about it. He just sat in the chair. The door's broken, she said. I know. They're going to need to move us to another room. In the morning. The kids' drawings are probably going to be different in the other room. He looked at her. Probably. She looked at the broken door with the cracked frame and the paint fractures and the long night sitting on the other side of it and said very quietly, Yunjae, I'm scared. I know, he said. Me too. She looked at him sharply, like the admission surprised her. He met her eyes and didn't take it back, because it was the truth. And he was going to give her the truth from now on, regardless of what it cost him. He was scared. He was scared in a way he hadn't been since before he'd learned to convert fear into operational fuel. Because the thing you were afraid of losing had to be something worth losing, and for the past 3 years, he hadn't had anything that qualified. Now he had 3 children and a broken door and a transplant starting in 2 days, and a betrayal 9 years deep that was going to require resolution. And the Serrano family was going to regroup, and somewhere in a vehicle in the parking lot was a man he'd trusted for 9 years who had given his daughter's existence to people who wanted him dead. He sat in the chair. He waited for morning. And in the bed, Nia Bennett, who would, Hyunjae had already decided, also carry the name Kang before this was finished, breathed in and Morning came in through the replacement room's window at 6:43 a.m., gray and flat, the kind of Los Angeles morning that couldn't commit to anything. They'd moved Nia at 4 a.m. to room 418, further from the east stairwell, a corner room with 2 windows and a heavier door that Torres had personally checked before allowing anyone inside. The transfer had taken 11 minutes, and Nia had been awake for all of it, watching the ceiling tiles move past from the gurney with the same steady, recording quality of attention that Hyunjae recognized in himself and found, in her, both painful and extraordinary. She hadn't complained. She'd asked once if her blocks were coming with them, and Zarya had said yes, and Nia had accepted this and gone quiet again. Hyunjae had not slept. He'd been in the chair by the door from 4 a.m. to 6:43, and in that time he'd made 11 phone calls, sent 30-some messages, and built in his mind the complete operational picture of what the next 72 hours required of him. The stimulation protocol for the transplant began at 7 a.m. Dr. Patel came herself, which he'd expected, with a nurse he hadn't seen before, and a cart with the first round of filgrastim injections. The medication that would force his bone marrow into overdrive, producing stem cells at a rate the body didn't do naturally, pushing them into the bloodstream where they could be harvested. She explained the side effects again with the same clean directness as before. Bone pain, fatigue, headaches, the specific discomfort of a body being driven past its ordinary parameters. "How functional will I be?" he asked. "During the protocol." She looked at him. "That depends on your pain tolerance and how your body responds. Some patients experience minimal disruption. Others are significantly impacted." "I need to be functional." "I understand. I'd recommend—" "I'm not asking for a recommendation. I'm asking what you need from me medically, and whether I can continue to operate outside this room during the 5 days of protocol." Dr. Patel studied him for a moment with an expression that wasn't quite judgment. She'd suspended judgment on him somewhere around hour 2 of their first meeting, he thought, and said, "You can continue to move around. You'll want to monitor your symptoms. If the bone pain becomes severe, pushing through it is not advisable." A pause. "But I suspect you'll push through it regardless." "Yes," he said. She gave him the first injection without ceremony. The pain started 4 hours later. It began in his lower back, a deep, structural ache that was nothing like muscle soreness, nothing like the ordinary physical damage he'd accumulated over the years and learned to manage. This came from inside the bone itself, from the marrow responding to the chemical instruction to produce beyond capacity. And it had a quality that was at once dull and acute, the way a sound can be both low and piercing. He was in the hospital's administrative conference room when it started, sitting across from the facility's chief medical officer, a careful political man named Hargrove, who had the specific energy of someone trying to determine the precise level of liability his institution had acquired overnight. And Marsh was beside him doing the majority of the talking, and Hyunjae was focused on keeping his expression neutral while his lower spine informed him, with increasing insistence, that something unprecedented was occurring inside it. He held it. He kept his hands flat on the table and his back straight, and he let Marsh manage Hargrove, and he focused on the operational problem, which was that in the next 48 hours, he needed to do 2 things simultaneously that were not compatible with each other in any conventional sense. He needed to undergo a medical protocol that would compromise his physical capacity day by day, and he needed to resolve the Serrano situation before it resolved itself in a direction he couldn't control. Marsh wrapped the administrative meeting in 40 minutes with a written commitment from Hargrove that Nia's transplant procedure would proceed on schedule, that the hospital would implement enhanced security protocols on the 4th floor for the duration of her stay, and that the events of the previous night would be addressed through the hospital's insurance and legal channels in a manner that did not require Hyunjae's personal involvement. It was a clean outcome, professionally executed, and it cost him a number he didn't examine in detail because the number was irrelevant. Afterward, in the corridor, Marsh said, "The Serrano situation. You need to tell me what you're planning." I'm planning to end it. That's not specific enough for me to help you. He stopped walking. The bone pain in his back had moved to his hips now, which Dr. Patel had said it would, the filgra steam working outward from the large marrow deposits in the pelvis and spine. He breathed through it, a precise and deliberate breath that came from years of practice. I'm going to sit down with Ramon Serrano directly. No intermediaries, no lawyers, just the two of us. Marsh looked at him for a long moment. And if he refuses? He won't. How do you know? Because I'm going to make him understand that the alternative to sitting down with me is considerably worse than sitting down with me. He started walking again. Arrange it for tonight. I want a neutral location, not his territory, not mine. Something public enough that no one does anything stupid. You're in the middle of a medical protocol. I'm aware. You're a bone marrow donor in active stimulation treatment. Marsh. He looked at him sideways. Arrange the meeting. Marsh arranged the meeting. He went back to room 418 at noon. Zarya was there with Nia, who was having a good morning, which meant she was sitting up and had eaten half a bowl of soup and was holding a conversation with Zarya about something she'd seen in a book, the specific focused enthusiasm of a child who had decided to be well today, regardless of what her body thought about it. Hyunjae stood in the doorway and watched this for a moment before either of them noticed him. Nia saw him first. You look like your back hurts, she said. Zarya looked up. The medicine, he said. It makes the bones work harder. It's fine. Nia considered this with the gravity of someone who had personal experience with medicine that made things hurt. Does it hurt a lot? Some. But you're still doing it. Yes. She nodded, as if this confirmed something she'd already determined about him. Then she went back to her book, apparently satisfied. Zarya stood and came to the doorway, moving him slightly out into the corridor with a look, and she pulled the door mostly closed behind her and then looked at his face with the directness she'd always had, that refusal to look at the surface of him when the actual information was somewhere below it. How bad? She said. Manageable. That's not a number. It doesn't need to be a number. It's manageable. He looked at her. The twins are good. Torres confirmed this morning. They're at the secure location. Delia is with them. Kai has apparently constructed something architectural with the toys that Delia described as structurally ambitious. Something moved across her face, relief and grief at the same time. That specific combination of a mother who needed her children where she could see them and understood why she couldn't. How much longer do they need to be there? Tonight. I'm meeting with the Serrano family head tonight. After that meeting, the situation changes. She stared at him. You're meeting Ramon Serrano? Yes. She gestured at him at the general fact of his current medical condition. The timing isn't ideal, he said, but the timing is what it is. Hyunjae, if I don't resolve this tonight, it doesn't get resolved on my terms. It gets resolved on his, and his terms involve continuing to look for openings, and the biggest opening available to him is the one he already knows about, which is the 4 floors above us. He held her gaze. I'm not going to let that sit open. Not while she's here. She pressed her lips together, looking at him with an expression that he was starting to be able to read more clearly. The layered thing it was, the anger and the fear, and the thing underneath both that she was still not naming. Come back, she said. Just that. I will. I'm not... She stopped. Tried again. I'm not asking you to promise me something operational. I don't know what's going to happen in that meeting, and neither do you. I'm just... She looked at the floor for a moment. Come back. That's all. He looked at her for a long moment. I'll come back, he said. The meeting was at a steakhouse in Culver City that stayed open until midnight and had a private dining room in the back that the owner, a Guatemalan-American man named Felix, who owed Hyunjae a favor from 4 years ago, made available without questions. Torres and Reyes were outside. The 2 men Serrano brought were outside also, which was the agreed condition. Principals only, no weapons inside the room. Hyunjae had a weapon inside the room regardless, in an ankle holster, because he was not an idealist. Ramon Serrano was 53, thick through the shoulders, with the specific quality of a man who had started in violence and graduated to administration without losing the muscle memory of the former. He had silver in his hair and a face that was simultaneously open and completely closed, the kind of face that had learned to present as readable while giving nothing away. He was already seated when Hyunjae came in, which was a positioning choice. You sit first, you own the room. Hyunjae noted it and sat across from him without comment. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The bone pain in Hyunjae's hips and spine had escalated through the afternoon to a level that he was managing through the specific discipline of not moving in ways that made it worse and not allowing it to register on his face. He was seated, and the chair was supportive, and he was keeping his back straight, and none of this was comfortable, but it was functional. He kept his hands on the table where Serrano could see them. "You wanted to talk," Serrano said. His English was excellent, slightly formal, the English of someone educated in it rather than raised in it. "I wanted to be clear," Hyunjae said. "About what?" "About what happens next." He looked at Serrano directly. "What happened last night was a mistake. Not a tactical mistake, a strategic one. You moved against me at a moment you believed was optimal, and it wasn't. And the reason it wasn't is that your intelligence was incomplete." Serrano's expression didn't shift. "My men were... I know what happened to your men. They're in police custody, which creates problems for you that have nothing to do with me." He paused. "The intelligence you received about my situation came from a compromised source, someone who was giving you information about my operations for 6 weeks. That person's analysis of my vulnerability was wrong. He told you I was distracted, minimally protected, unable to respond. He was wrong on all 3 counts." A silence. Serrano was watching him with a stillness that was its own kind of language. "My daughter," Hyunjae said, "is in that hospital because she has leukemia. She is 2 years old. What your people did last night, moving on a pediatric floor, in a building with sick children, is the kind of thing that doesn't stay in the business world. That goes somewhere else. That attracts attention from people who are not in our business and who do not operate by our rules." He held Serrano's gaze. "You don't want that attention. Neither do I. But you brought it considerably closer than it was before last night." Serrano was quiet for a moment, then, "The port contract is not worth what you spent last night trying to get it." Hyunjae kept his voice level. "The port contract is a revenue dispute. What you did last night was personal, and personal is a category of problem that doesn't resolve through business logic." Something moved in Serrano's face. Not guilt. Men in his position didn't do guilt exactly, but something adjacent to calculation, a reassessment of the architecture of the situation. "What do you want?" Serrano said. "The port contract goes to mediated arbitration, neutral third party, binding resolution. Whatever the arbitrator determines, we both accept." He paused. "In exchange, this ends. Tonight. Completely. No further action, no further positioning, no further interest in my family or my location or my current medical situation." Serrano looked at him. "And the men in custody? That's your problem. I didn't put them there." "But you could..." "No," Hyunjae said. "I couldn't. What I can do is ensure that the additional information I have about your operations' involvement in last night's events doesn't reach the people who would find it interesting. That's what I'm offering in exchange for the arbitration agreement and a clean stop." He looked at Serrano without expression. "That's the whole offer. It doesn't get better from here." Serrano was quiet for a long time. He looked at his hands on the table. He looked at the room's neutral walls, the frame nothing of a private dining room designed for conversations exactly like this one. He looked at Hyunjae. "Your source," he said, "the one inside your organization. Being handled. He gave us..." "I know what he gave you. It doesn't matter now." He shifted slightly in the chair, and the bone pain moved in response. A sharp, deep reminder that his body was doing something extraordinary right now, that every hour he sat in this chair, instead of lying flat in a hospital bed, was an hour he was taking from himself. He breathed through it. "Do we have an agreement?" Serrano looked at him for a long time. "Your daughter," he said, finally. "She'll recover." It wasn't a question, exactly. It was something between a question and a statement, with a quality to it that Hyunjae recognized. The specific tone of a man who had children himself and was drawing a line, belatedly, around what last night had actually meant. "I intend for her to recover," Hyunjae said. Serrano nodded, once, slowly. Arbitration, he said. And a clean stop. Yes. I'll need 48 hours to pull everyone back. You have 24. Serrano looked at him again. Then he reached across the table and his hand was there, flat, palm down. Not a handshake exactly, more the placement of a hand that said the conversation was concluded in the particular way that certain conversations concluded. Hyun-jae put his hand over it briefly, removed it. They stood simultaneously, the way men in their world stood at the end of things that were decided. No lingering, no pleasantries. The meeting over the moment the business was over. Serrano left first. Hyun-jae stood at the table alone for a moment, his hand on the back of the chair, breathing deliberately through the pain in his hips and back that had been sitting at a level 7 for the past 2 hours and was not improving with sitting upright in a restaurant chair for 40 minutes. Torres came in 30 seconds after Serrano's men left. Clean, Torres said, meaning the exchange outside had been clean, no incidents, everyone departing in the expected directions. Good! He straightened up carefully, the deliberate movement of someone managing a body that was currently unreliable. Get me back to the hospital. Torres looked at him with the professionally neutral expression that meant he was noticing something he wasn't going to comment on unless asked. You need to stop somewhere first. Medical attention? Hospital, Hyun-jae said. Meridian General. Torres didn't argue. He held the door. Spatske. He was back at room 418 by 11 p.m. The corridor was quiet. The fourth floor had the particular late-night hospital stillness that was different from actual quiet, layered with the sound of monitors and distant PA announcements and the soft movement of the night shift. The additional security Marsh had arranged was visible at the elevator bank and the stairwell doors, which he noted and assessed as adequate. He stopped outside room 418. Through the glass panel, he could see the room in low light. Nia sleeping, the monitor's green steadiness, and Zarya in the chair. Not asleep. Looking at the door, she'd been waiting for him. He went inside. She looked at his face when he came in, and he knew she could read it. The pain was harder to manage now, moving through his thighs and his lower back with a grinding insistence that was past the level he could fully contain behind expression. He was also tired in a way that the previous night's non-sleep and the morning's meetings had compounded into something structural. Done, he said. She looked at him. Done how? Arbitration on the port contract, clean stop on the rest. 24 hours for him to pull back. He came to the second chair. The room had two. He'd ensured that, some logistical arrangement Marsh had made, and sat in it carefully, in the way that revealed more than he wanted it to. It's done. She watched him sit. How bad is the pain? I've had worse. That's not... Zarya. He looked at her. I'm fine. The protocol is working. Dr. Patel said the early pain response is actually an indicator of strong marrow output, which is what we want. She looked at him for a long time, and in the low light of room 418, with Naya breathing steadily in the bed between them, something in Zarya's expression shifted from the wariness that had been present since the first moment in the corridor, since before that, since the moment he'd stepped into her field of vision and her body had gone rigid with recognition and fear, into something that wasn't quite peace, but was adjacent to it. The beginning of peace, the shape of it. Kai asked about you again, she said. When I called to check in, he asked when the quiet man was coming back. He looked at his hands. What did you tell him? He said. I told him soon. She paused. I told him the quiet man is your father, and he's coming back soon. The room was very still. He looked at her. She looked at him with clear eyes, with the specific clarity of someone who has made a decision that cost something significant and has made it anyway. Okay, he said. Just that. She nodded. Outside the window, Los Angeles was doing what it did, existing at the scale of a city that didn't stop for private moments, that ran its traffic and its lights and its particular grinding beauty, regardless of what was being decided in the rooms above it. He could see the glow of it against the sky, the ambient light of a place that never went fully dark. He was going to sit in this chair until morning. He was going to be here when Dr. Patel came for the second round of injections. He was going to be here for the 3 days of protocol that remained, and for the collection procedure and for whatever the 100 days after the transplant required of him. He was going to be in this building, and then he was going to be wherever Naya and Kai and Amara were. And that was a fixed point now, an operational constant that nothing upstream was going to move. His phone vibrated. He looked at the screen. Minji. Seo is in custody. Voluntary, through Marsh. Full cooperation with the arrangement. He put the phone away. Zarya had seen him look at the phone and was watching him with a question she hadn't asked. "It's handled," he said. "All of it." She looked at him for a moment more. Then she settled back in her chair and looked at Nia, at the steady green numbers, at the quiet small fact of her daughter breathing in and out in the low light of a room where nothing dangerous was currently present. "Get some sleep," she said. "You need it." "I'm fine." "Hyunjae." She looked at him sideways. "Sleep. I'll watch the door." He looked at her. He looked at the door. He looked at Naya and the monitor and the green numbers and the particular quality of a room that contained 3 people, and one of them was fighting for her life, and 2 of them were, for the first time in a long time, not fighting each other. He closed his eyes. The bone pain didn't stop. It sat in his hips and his spine like something grinding and continuous, and he breathed through it with the slow, deliberate rhythm of a man who had decided that the body's objections were noted and overruled, and somewhere in the grinding of it, he felt the chair against his back and the low sounds of the hospital going about its work, and Zarya's presence across from him, real, present, not a city he couldn't find, and the monitor's steady green reporting of a heartbeat that was... He slept for 4 hours and 20 minutes, which was more than he'd slept in the previous 3 days combined. When he woke, the room was different in the specific way rooms are different when the light has shifted. The window had gone from dark to the particular gray-blue of early morning, that hour before the city commits to being awake, and Zarya was asleep in her chair with her head tilted against the wall and her arms crossed over her chest in the posture of someone who fell asleep defending a position. Naya's monitor continued its green reporting. The numbers were the same. The breathing was the same. He sat still for a moment and let himself be inside it. The room, the quiet, the fact of his daughter 8 feet away, and the mother of his children 5 feet to his left, and the bone pain that had, somewhere in the 4 hours of unconsciousness, reorganized itself from a sharp, grinding presence into something duller and more pervasive. The kind of pain that tells you it's settling in for the duration rather than trying to get your attention. Day 3 of the stimulation protocol. 2 more days before collection. He stood carefully, which woke Zarya. She came to alertness fast, the way people do when they've been sleeping in a state of sustained vigilance, and looked at him, and then at Naya, and then at the window, taking inventory. "How long?" she said. 4 hours. Maybe a little more. She looked at his face with the diagnostic focus she'd developed over the past 3 days, reading him for pain level the way Dr. Patel read charts. The pain's different, deeper, less acute. He rolled his left shoulder carefully. "It's fine." She didn't argue with it, which meant she was choosing her battles, which was something new. 3 days ago, she would have argued with it on principle. He noted the change without remarking on it. "The twins are coming back today," she said. It wasn't a question. Torres had confirmed the previous night that with the Serrano situation resolved and the 24-hour withdrawal window closing, the secure location was no longer necessary. "This afternoon," he said. "Seo's car is gone. Torres is bringing them himself." She nodded. She looked at Nia. "She had a good night. I checked with the nurse at 3. Her numbers are..." She stopped, reworked the sentence. "They're not worse, which is what we're working with right now." "Not worse is enough," he said. "For right now, not worse is enough." She looked at him. "You sound like Dr. Patel." She's right about most things. A pause between them, the kind that had begun to feel different over the past 72 hours, less like the silence of 2 people who didn't know what to say, and more like the silence of 2 people who were allowing themselves to be in the same room without the armor of constant speech. "I want to say something," Zarya said. She was looking at her hands. "And I need you to let me finish before you respond." "Okay. I've been thinking about what I told you in the consultation room, about why I left. And I've been thinking about whether, if I'd made a different choice 3 years ago, if I'd stayed and told you and tried to build something that included all of this." She gestured, a small motion that encompassed the room, the hospital, the whole architecture of the situation. I don't know that it would have been better. I genuinely don't. I think what I was afraid of was real. I think the risk was real. She paused. But I also know that Nia has been fighting this for 8 months, and I've been doing it alone, and there were a lot of moments, where I was so tired I couldn't. She stopped. Her jaw worked for a second. I needed someone, and I had no one, because I made sure of it. I made sure I had no one because I was afraid of the specific someone I'd left. She finally looked up at him. I'm not asking you to tell me I was wrong. I wanted to say that I know what the choice cost, both of us. He sat with it for a moment, let it settle. 3 years ago, he said carefully, if you'd told me about the children, I don't know what I would have changed. You were right about that. In the consultation room, I wouldn't have walked away from the business. Not immediately, maybe not for a long time. He paused. But I want you to know something. The version of me that's been sitting in this chair for the past 3 days. That's not a new version. That's the same one. The same person who was looking for you for 2 years. The capacity for this was always there. He looked at Nia. I just didn't have the reason to show it yet. Zarya looked at him for a long time. I know, she said. Quiet. That's the part that's been the hardest to sit with. The collection procedure happened on day 6. Dr. Patel had scheduled it for 7 in the morning, and the preparation began the night before. Final blood work, confirmation of the stem cell count in his peripheral blood, the specific technical assessment of whether his body had produced what Nia needed in the quantity required. The numbers came back at 11 p.m. on day 5, and Dr. Patel came to room 418 herself, which had become her habit, and told them both that the yield was exceptional. His body had responded to the protocol at the high end of the response range. The collection would proceed at full capacity. He'd spent day 5 and the evening of day 5 increasingly unable to pretend that the bone pain was manageable in the way he'd been managing it. It had reached a level that required active, deliberate processing, not hiding exactly, but the sustained application of attention to keeping it from consuming the bandwidth he needed for other things. Zarya had watched him through day 5 without saying much, bringing him water when he forgot to drink it, making sure he ate, none of which she announced or performed. She simply did it, the way you do things for someone you've stopped pretending you're indifferent to. The twins had come back on day 4 afternoon, as Torres had confirmed they would. Kai had walked into room 418 with the specific purposeful energy of a small person who had been somewhere unfamiliar and was now returning to the primary source. And he'd gone directly to Nia's bed and stood beside it and said her name, and Nia had opened her eyes and said his name back. And the sound of that exchange, 2 children, siblings, the simple transactional fact of each other's presence confirmed, hit Hyunjae somewhere behind the sternum that he hadn't known was accessible. Kai had then turned and looked at him and said, You stayed. I stayed, Hyunjae said. Kai had accepted this and gone to investigate the room's second window with the thoroughness of a small architectural assessor. Amara had gone directly to Zarya and stayed there for most of the afternoon, which he understood and didn't take personally. He was new. Amara was cautious with new. He'd watched her from across the room, this small, serious girl who had her mother's caution and what he was beginning to recognize as her own particular intelligence, and he'd given her the space she needed and waited, because waiting was something he was capable of when the thing worth waiting for was clear. On the evening of day 5, while Zarya was in the corridor with Kai and Amara, the playroom had become a reliable resource for the hours when Nia was sleeping and the twins needed to be somewhere that wasn't a hospital room. Nia had been awake and quiet, and Hyunjae had been in the chair beside her bed, and she'd said, without preamble, in the particular way she had of beginning conversations as if they'd already been in progress, Does it hurt? What you're doing for me? He'd looked at her. He could have said no. The calculation for saying no was clear. She was 2 years old. She didn't need the weight of knowing the answer. Protection of children from difficult truths was a coherent principle. He'd looked at her and seen her mother's directness looking back at him, and he'd decided that this child was owed the same quality of honesty that her mother had eventually received. Some, he said. She'd looked at him with those dark, steady eyes. But you're still doing it. Yes. Because you're my dad, she said. The word arrived without warning and without ceremony. She said it with the clean simplicity of a child who had been told a true thing and had organized it into her understanding of the world without drama. Zarya had told her, at some point in the past 4 days, he didn't know exactly when, didn't know what words she'd used, and Nia had taken the information and placed it into her world where it belonged, and now she was stating it the way she stated other true things, as a given. He'd sat very still for a moment. "Yes," he said, "because I'm your dad." She'd nodded, satisfied, and gone back to her book. He'd sat in the chair for a few minutes after that, doing nothing except being in the specific fact of having been called that word, in that room, by that particular small person, and whatever it cost him to do what he was doing, the pain, the exposure, the structural vulnerability of being a man like him in a position like this, it recalibrated in that moment into something that wasn't even a consideration. The collection procedure took 6 hours. He lay in the apheresis unit with a line in each arm. Blood out one side, processed, stem cells separated by the machine, blood returned on the other. And he watched the ceiling and managed the bone pain that had reached its peak precisely as Dr. Patel had predicted it would, the day of collection being the point of maximum marrow response. It was a focused, sustained effort that required most of his available attention. He kept his breathing even and his body still because movement complicated the process, and he thought about the room 3 floors up where Nia would be receiving her preparatory conditioning for the transplant, the final round of treatment designed to clear the space in her marrow for what was coming. He thought about Kai's tower of blocks, about the way Amara had, on the morning of day 5, brought a book across the room and dropped it in his lap without explanation, and then climbed into the chair beside him with the determined air of someone making a decision they'd thought through carefully. He'd looked at the book, a board book about animals, the pages worn from use, and opened it and read it to her. And she'd sat beside him with her shoulder against his arm and looked at the pictures with the focused seriousness she brought to most things, and not once during the reading had she moved away. He thought about Zarya saying "come back" and meaning it as more than an instruction. He thought about Seo, which he did in the controlled way he thought about things that required resolution that wasn't yet complete. The arrangement Marsh had made, Seo's cooperation with the legal process in exchange for a degree of managed exposure, was the functional solution, the one that minimized collateral damage and addressed the intelligence breach without creating additional problems. He'd accepted it because it was correct, operationally. But he sat with it too, in the way you sit with the fact of someone's betrayal when that someone had been in the car with you for 9 years. You don't process it quickly. You don't process it once. It sits in the body alongside everything else, and you carry it. And eventually, not today, not this week, you put it somewhere it doesn't take up operational space. He thought about the port contract arbitration, which Minji had already begun organizing through a neutral commercial arbitration service in San Francisco. Whatever the arbitrator decided, he'd accepted. The outcome was less important than the ending of the thing, and the thing was ended. He thought about the Serrano meeting, the hand across the table, the particular quality of a man recognizing that the calculation had shifted. He'd done that before, made that kind of peace with men who'd been trying to destroy him. He knew the value of it and the limits of it. The Serrano situation was resolved. Not forgiven, that wasn't a category that applied, but resolved, done, closed. The machine beside him continued its work. He lay still and breathed and let it. Dr. Patel delivered the stem cells to Nia's room at 4:17 p.m. The transplant itself, the actual infusion of the collected cells into Nia's bloodstream, where they would travel to her bone marrow and either take hold and begin producing healthy cells or not, took less time than the collection. It was administered through her central line, a process that looked from the outside like almost nothing. A bag of pale fluid, a line, a pump, numbers on a monitor. Zarya sat on the bed beside Nia, holding her hand, and Hyunjae stood near the window. He'd been told to rest, had agreed and not rested, had instead come directly from the apheresis unit to room 418 because there was nowhere else he was going to be for this. And Nia had watched the bag with the alert interest she brought to most things, and asked Dr. Patel if it was going to hurt. "You might feel a little cold," Dr. Patel said. "That's normal." Nia had accepted this, looked at the window, looked at Hyunjae, and said, "It's like a trade." He looked at her. What is? You give me yours, and then I get better. She considered this with the gravity of a small person working through a logical sequence. And then you stop hurting. He looked at her for a moment. Something like that, he said. She nodded and went back to watching the bag. He stood at the window and looked at Los Angeles in the late afternoon light, which was finally doing what Los Angeles light was supposed to do. Gold and warm, and coming in at an angle that made everything it touched look briefly like it was worth more than it was. The city spread out below, its ordinary chaos, its indifferent beauty, the millions of lives happening simultaneously in every direction. He'd spent 12 years building a structure that gave him control over a significant portion of what moved through this city. The goods, the money, the invisible architecture of supply and connection that ran beneath the visible one. He'd told himself, in the periods when he examined the choices he'd made, that the structure was a means to an end, that the end was security, and that security was what he'd been building toward since the years before Los Angeles, when he'd understood that the world offered you two positions, controlling or controlled, and had made his choice. He still believed that, functionally. He believed it less cleanly now. He looked at the bag of pale fluid and the line and the pump and his daughter's hand in Zaria's, and he thought about what it meant that the most significant thing he'd ever produced, the thing that 12 years of structure and power and ruthless, careful work had ultimately been building toward without his knowing it, was currently receiving a transfusion in room 418 and asking sensible questions about temperature. He thought about what Minji had said to him on the phone 2 nights ago, after the meeting with Serrano, after everything. She'd said, "You're different." He told her he wasn't. She'd said, "You will be. Whether you know it yet or not, you will be." He stood at the window and watched the light, and thought that Minji was probably right about most things too. The 100 days after a bone marrow transplant were called the critical window, and they were exactly that, a period during which the transplanted cells either engrafted or didn't, during which the body either accepted the foreign biology or rejected it, during which every fever and every blood result and every small change in the patient's condition was either a sign that the graft was taking hold or a sign that it wasn't. He stayed in Los Angeles for all of it. He moved operations. Minji ran the day-to-day from the Wilshire office, which she was entirely capable of doing. She had been, in honesty, capable of doing it for some time, and the degree to which he'd been present in the operational details was partly necessity and partly the particular habit of a man who trusted the structure he'd built more than he trusted anyone else's capacity to maintain it. He began to revise that. Not entirely. He wasn't a different person, hadn't undergone a transformation that erased 12 years of who he'd been, but he redistributed. He made calls from the hospital, from the penthouse, when Nia's numbers were stable enough to allow him an overnight, from the car between the two. He arranged for the legal documentation of paternity to be filed. Marsh handled it with the same quiet efficiency he handled everything, and Hyun-jae reviewed the documents himself, line by line, because these were not documents he was delegating the understanding of. Kai, Naya, and Amara Kang. He looked at the names in their legal form and didn't feel what he'd expected to feel, which was something large and declarative. What he felt was quieter, the specific satisfaction of a thing being made correct. He told Zaria before the filing because that was the correct order of things. She'd been sitting at the kitchen table of the apartment he'd arranged for them. A 2-bedroom in Brentwood, walking distance from the hospital, the lease under a name that wasn't his but whose payments were his, and she'd looked at the documents and then looked at him and said, "You didn't have to ask me. I know. You have the legal right. I know that too." He sat across from her. "I'm asking anyway." She looked at the documents for a long time. Outside the kitchen window, the Brentwood neighborhood was doing its early evening thing. A dog walker, a car going past, the particular quiet of a residential street in a city that was never actually quiet. "Kang," she said, trying the name. "Nia Kang. Nia Kang," she said again. Different tone, not trying it, settling it. "Okay." She looked at him. "Yes." He signed the documents that evening, and Marsh filed them the following morning. On day 47, Dr. Patel came to the apartment. She didn't usually come to the apartment. Her contact had been through the hospital and through phone calls. and her presence at the door at 10 in the morning with a tablet in her hand and an expression that Hyun-jae, answering the door, could not immediately read, stopped something in his chest. Zarya appeared from the hallway behind him, reading his stillness. Dr. Patel looked at them both. "The latest bone marrow biopsy results," she said. "I wanted to deliver them in person." A pause. The pause that contained everything. "The graft is taken. Full engraftment. Nia's marrow is producing healthy cells. Her blast count is negligible." She looked at them. "The leukemia is in complete remission." The word remission moved through the room like something physical. Zarya made a sound he had never heard from her before. Not a sob, not a cry. Something prior to both. Something that came from a place below language. She pressed both hands over her mouth and her eyes closed, and she stood in the hallway of the apartment and made that sound. And he put his hand on her back because that was what his hand did before he'd made a decision about it. Dr. Patel said something else. Monitoring schedule, continued blood work, the importance of the remaining days in the critical window. The caveat that remission was not the same as cure, and they would be watching for years. And he heard all of it and filed it correctly and said the right things, because that was the part of him that didn't stop working regardless of what the other parts were doing. But underneath the operational function, something was happening that was less organized. Something was adjusting, the way a structure adjusts when the primary load it was built to carry is removed. Not collapsing, but settling into a new configuration, finding where the weight would distribute now that the specific weight it had been holding was lifted. When Dr. Patel left, he closed the door. Zarya was in the hallway still, leaning against the wall with her hands at her sides now, and her eyes open and the light from the window at the end of the hall coming across her face at an angle. She was looking at him with an expression that was, he didn't have a word for it, that was exactly right. It was everything. It was 3 years and a parking lot, and a consultation room, and a broken door, and a 6-hour collection procedure, and 47 days of blood results. And it was also something much simpler and much older than any of that. "She's going to be okay," Zarya said, like she was testing the sentence, like she needed to say it aloud to verify that it was real. "She's going to be okay," he said. Zarya looked at him for a long moment. Then she walked toward him and she put her arms around him. Not tentatively, not with the hesitation of someone who wasn't sure, but with the directness she brought to everything. And he put his arms around her and they stood in the hallway of an apartment in Brentwood and held on. And neither of them said anything because there was nothing to say that hadn't already been said or that couldn't wait. 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning that was neither gray nor committed to anything else, Nia Kang came home. Home was not yet a permanent definition. There were conversations still ahead. Decisions about where and how and what the shape of their life would actually look like in the long construction of it. Those conversations had started and would continue in the particular way that real conversations between complicated people continue, not resolved in a single exchange, not finished, but ongoing, each one moving something incrementally toward a configuration that worked. What Hyun-jae knew, with the certainty he brought to things he decided, he was not walking away. What that looked like in the practical terms of years was still being built, the way all structures were built. One decision at a time, with attention to what was holding and what needed reinforcement. He was changing the business, not abandoning it. He was not naive about what that meant, what it cost, what it left exposed, but restructuring it, systematically, towards something with less exposure and less operational violence and more of the legitimate infrastructure that had always been the cleaner end of what he'd built. It would take time. Minji said 3 years minimum to complete the transition to something that didn't require the parts he was removing. He'd told her to move at the pace that didn't create new problems while solving existing ones, and she'd said, with the particular Minji dryness, "So, carefully." And he'd said yes, carefully. He wasn't a different person. He knew that. The capacity for the things he was capable of didn't leave because he wanted it to. It was structural. It was 12 years deep and more. It was who he was in the places that didn't change with circumstance. Zarya knew that. She'd said it to him, plainly, on a night when the twins were asleep and Nia's latest blood work had come back clean, and they'd been sitting at the kitchen table with the remains of a meal neither of them had been particularly hungry for. "You're still you," she'd said. "Yes. I know that. I'm not..." She'd looked at her hands. I'm not expecting you to be someone else. I stopped expecting that a long time ago. Then what are you expecting? He'd said. She'd looked at him. I'm expecting you to show up, same way you've been showing up. That's it. That's what I need. She'd paused. Can you do that? Yes, he'd said, without hesitation, without qualification. I can do that. She'd looked at him for a moment longer, with the assessing directness that was one of the things about her that had never changed. And then she'd said, okay? And that had been that. The Tuesday that Nia came home, the weather had finally decided to be what Los Angeles weather was supposed to be. Warm and clear, the light coming in clean, and the sky doing its particular blue that you couldn't replicate anywhere else. The color of a place that was occasionally, on the right morning, worth all of what it cost to be in it. Kai and Amara were already at the apartment when Torres brought Nia in from the hospital van. Kai had been informed of the exact arrival time and had stationed himself at the window for the previous 40 minutes, which Hyunjae had watched with the specific private sensation of a man who recognizes himself in someone else and doesn't know quite what to do with the recognition. Amara had remained on the couch reading her book with the deliberate composure of someone pretending they weren't also waiting. When the door opened and Zarya carried Nia through it, Kai abandoned the window immediately and came across the room with the focused speed of small person who has been patient for as long as small people can be patient, and the reunion that followed was unmanaged and complete. The three of them on the floor, Nia less fragile-looking than she'd been 2 months ago, her hair beginning to grow back in small, dark curls that Zarya touched sometimes with a wondering quality, like she was confirming something. Hyunjae stood near the kitchen doorway. He watched his children on the floor of the apartment, and he felt what he felt, which was not something he had a clean word for and didn't need one. It was enough to feel it. It was more than enough. Zarya came to stand beside him, a few inches away, looking at the same thing. She asked this morning, Zarya said, if she could have a dog. He looked at her sideways. Absolutely not, he said. Zarya smiled. A real one. Not the shape of a smile, but the actual thing, which he'd been collecting the occurrences of with the specific attention he brought to things that mattered. That's what I said. And she said she'd ask you instead. Zarya looked at him. So, he looked at Nia, who had apparently already registered that this conversation was happening, and was looking at him from across the room with the steady, patient expression of someone who has inherited from both parents a quality of waiting that could outlast almost anything. He looked at Zarya. We'll discuss it, he said. Zarya's smile stayed. She looked back at the children on the floor, and her shoulder was almost against his, and the apartment was warm with the morning light coming through the windows and the specific sounds of 3 children who were alive and present and somewhere safe. He stood there. He let himself stand there. The man who had ruled an empire, who had made decisions that couldn't be unmade, who had built a structure out of control and distance and the particular discipline of never letting anything matter too much. He stood in a bright apartment on a Tuesday morning in Los Angeles, and he watched his daughter come home. And for the first time in a very long time, the city outside the window was not something he was trying to own or outrun or understand. It was just where he lived. It was where they lived. He put his hand briefly, lightly, at the small of Zarya's back, not claiming, not asking anything, just the plain fact of his hand there, present. And she didn't move away. Outside, Los Angeles went about its endless, indifferent business. Inside, Kai was building something with blocks again, stacking one on another with the patient certainty of someone who wasn't thinking about whether towers fall. Right now, they didn't. Right now, the tower was standing.